All right, welcome everybody. I just introduced myself, but I'm Andrew. Can you guys hear me okay? Because with the mask, we had some people in the back this morning that were having trouble. So, like I said, I'm Andrew. I am not Bob Baxter. Bob cannot be here. I am not as good as Bob Baxter, but I have a very nitpicky personality, so I love reading the Bible and trying to figure out all the little nuances. And so you're about to be exposed to some of that with our readings for this weekend. It's the 29th Sunday of Ordinary Time. The first reading is from Isaiah. It's Isaiah chapter 53, 10 through 11. And to get into that, we need someone to volunteer to read 2 whole verses of the Bible. 2. All right. Now, can you step up to the microphone so our folks at home can hear you?
First reading from Isaiah, verses 10 to 11. The Lord was pleased to crush him in infirmity. If he gives his life as an offering for sin, he shall see his descendants in a long life, and the will of the Lord shall be accomplished through him. Because of his affliction, he shall see the light in fullness of days. Through his suffering, my servant shall justify many, and their guilt he shall bear.
The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Beautiful job reading that, by the way. Really, you had a good cadence. You were slow. It helped me meditate. So, are there any initial thoughts or like things that strike us or anything flaring up when we read that? It's kind of provocative. Should I turn this so we can see better? I can totally do that. If not, there's no pressure. Let's look at just a couple things in this reading. The first thing, which is maybe one of the more nitpicky things, is talking about the context. Because anyone can take a verse out of the Bible out of context and start saying all this crazy stuff about anything. So when we read the scriptures, we read it as a whole, and we read the book as a whole, and we read what's around the book. Because especially in the ancient world, usually what frames your pericope, your language, is basically what informs what makes it mean what it means. The context of this poem, this is the late chapters of Isaiah, are known as the suffering servant. Isaiah starts off prophesying about, everything bad that's going to happen to Israel because Israel is putting its faith in idols, it's putting its faith in political alliances, it's putting its faith in all this stuff that is not a genuine relationship with God. And he talks about how Israel's not going to be able to stand like that. God can't protect you, or God can't use Israel as an example if they're not in a good relationship with him. So Isaiah talks about the downfall of Israel in 586 BC is when they get taken over by Babylon. And then the book of Isaiah goes on. We don't know if it was Isaiah or if it was some of Isaiah's disciples who kept prophesying, but it talks about the return of Jerusalem to the promised land. And then it goes even further. And in these last few chapters, there's this like section of poetry about some guy, some servant, some person who undergoes some great suffering, and God brings a lot of good out of it. There's a number of poems, but this one is really interesting because most of it's like we just read. It's about he's crushed in infirmity. It talks about him being marred beyond human appearance. It talks about how he perished in a parched earth, how he was spurned and avoided by men, a man of suffering. But the bookends of this poem are nothing like that. The poem starts on Isaiah chapter 52, and it's kind of weird. St. Jerome put chapters in the Bible in the 4th century. Up until then, every book was actually just one run-on sentence, and he started doing some grammar, and I can't tell if he messed it up or whoever was doing his copywriting messed it up. But he really set these chapters up so they don't fit, especially in Isaiah. You'll read, and Isaiah will start a thought, and then the chapter ends, and then the next chapter is him finishing the thought he started. So anyways, just me geeking out a little bit. But Isaiah 52, the last 3 verses start out saying, "See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be raised high and greatly exalted." Then, if we go with what we just read, 10 and 11, the last verse of the poem is, "Therefore I will give him his portion among the great, and he shall divide the spoils with many." All this suffering that this individual, this servant, and people argue, is the servant Jesus? Is the servant some other guy? Is the servant Isaiah himself? Is the servant just kind of this stand-in figure for the whole people of Israel? And today we look at it and say, well, Jesus kind of counts for all of that, doesn't he? He stands in for all of us. He's this kind of priestly, larger-than-life figure. But talking about all this terrible stuff that's going to happen to him, all these sacrifices he's making, all the infirmity and, the affliction that he goes through and the suffering, also happens in the context of he himself and maybe a lot of the people connected to him are going to be glorified somehow. And they seem like opposites, and that's one of the things that happens in the scriptures in the Bible, in our faith, is opposites come together somehow. And that's what we call mystery. When things that don't seem to fit together, God brings them together. It's more than we can understand, but it's still beautiful, and it still it moves us somehow. Anyway, the poetry, especially in this part of Isaiah, it jumps around by who the speaker is. Sometimes, obviously, you're listening to the voice of God talk to the people of Israel. Sometimes you're listening to who appears to be the servant. You know, there's the verses that say, "I gave my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who plucked my beard." Well, that first person language, that's the servant. In this poem, this part of the poem, it's actually identified when you go back to some of the earlier poetry. There's a third set of characters, and they're called the servants, who are, we're not sure how, they're connected to the servant. And they're like kind of witnesses to the servant. These people who basically because of what the servant has done, they become servants after him. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in Isaiah. We can't figure out what he's talking about exactly. There's theories. Until you read the New Testament, then it makes sense in like a whole new way, and it all kind of comes together, which is cool, right? And these servants, there's the servant's suffering, and then the servant's Israel becoming what Isaiah would call like a light to the nations. They go out and all this salvation that this one suffering servant wins for Israel, the rest of Israel kind of spreads throughout the world, and the world comes to Israel and kind of rebounds and gets to participate in that. And most of us who have been in the, Christian for most of our lives can kind of see the theological implication there, right? Anyway, yeah, so just a little about that first one, but let's especially remember oh, I forgot to put this on the thing. Okay, let's also remember there's two words in here that are very, for me at least, very interesting. And if I blabber on too long, tell me to shut up. Like really, it won't offend me. But it says, he gives his life as an offering for sin. And it says, their guilt he shall bear. Sin and guilt, they're very closely related, but they're not exactly the same thing, right? In the Old Testament, in Leviticus chapters 4 and 5, there were two different modes of sacrifice. There was one called a sin offering, and that's for when the people broke God's law, and they'd put their hands on a bull, and then they'd sacrifice the bull, and they'd spread the bull's blood 7 times and spread it on them, and there's this big atonement for the sin and the guilt. And then there's another offering called the guilt offering. The sin offering makes people holy. The guilt offering is not so much about holiness or sin, it's more about restitution or getting even. And the example they give in Leviticus is a guilt offering is when like you forgot to put your money in the collection plate. You owe God this. The sin offering isn't so much focused on what you owe God or where the justice comes in. It's more about holiness. The guilt is about kind of the objective problem between you and God. What needs to be made restitution for. The sin offering is more about becoming holy and becoming close to God and become set aside again. And I only mention that here because I think that rebounds in the next couple readings, and I want to geek out about that for you guys, if that's okay.
Where did you say that is?
Leviticus 4 and 5.
Oh,
And you really have to read them close, but in the guilt offering, you don't put your hands on the animal that's sacrificed. You don't transfer your sin onto it. You're just sacrificing an animal basically as like a repayment to God for something you owe him. And in the sin offering, it involves more of the community and the priest and the sanctuary. Anyways, let's move on because I have talked way too long. If I could get this to work. The psalm, we'll just cover real quick. I think the psalm that we sing is always the most underrated part of Mass because we listen to the first reading, or we usually have the attention span to listen to the first reading, and then the singer comes up and they sing a phrase, and then we sing the phrase, and then the singer sings for about 30 seconds, and then they lift up their hand, and we kind of start mumbling until the rest of the congregation remembers what we're supposed to say, and then we say it. The point of the psalm, though, is to take what we've heard from that first reading, and we get to respond, and we get to talk back and pray back to God about it. The Psalms are, the major part of Scripture that it's not so much God speaking to us, but it's us speaking to God. It's David speaking to God. It's Christ speaking to the Father through David. And so this is a chance for us to take what the first reading told us and pray back to God in God's own words, and make it that two-way dialogue. And it says, Lord, let your mercy be upon us as we place our trust in you. Which makes a whole lot of sense considering, this suffering servant who gets crushed in infirmity. Because of his affliction, he sees light in the fullness of days. Through his suffering, he justifies many. Suffering for God takes a lot of trust. And so we go on to say, the eyes of the Lord are upon those who fear him, upon those who hope in his kindness to deliver them from death and preserve them in spite of famine. Our soul waits for the Lord, who is our help and our shield. May your kindness, O Lord, be upon us, who have put our hope in you. It is the correct response when you're talking about the cost of salvation, right? Is to say how much we trust God, even though the sorts of things God are talking about are really tough and gritty and not things we're inclined to trust through. So we respond with that. Volunteer for the second reading. Go for it, Glenda. Yeah, that's fine. It is Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. So 3 verses this time. We're getting more complicated. We're working our way up.
A reading from the letter to the Hebrews. Brothers and sisters, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has similarly been tested in every way, yet without sin. So let us confidently approach the throne of grace to receive mercy and to find grace for timely help. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Any initial impressions there? There's a few parts of this reading that I think jump out to us in a really kind of heartfelt way, and then there's a few parts that are a little more like fancy language and we might have trouble talking about. But what strikes you there?
Well, the idea that we have that Jesus lived and went through all the things that we go through. So when it says he can sympathize, I mean, he didn't sin, but he had he had the temptations, he had the hurts and and the joys and everything else. So he can actually relate to us as people, as opposed to just holiness and God and this thing that's above.
Yes. Jesus does not save us from above. He saves us from right where we are, and him coming down to where we are and having to deal with where we are and love us through that, which is huge, really huge. Let's go over just real quick a couple of points about Hebrews. Overall, Hebrews is a very theological letter. The book of Hebrews takes Jesus and tries to explain why Jesus fulfills the Hebrew religion. The only other letter in the New Testament that is so theological and systematic and dense is Paul's letter to the Romans. But when Paul's writing the Romans, he's not writing Jewish people. The Hebrews is, to the Hebrews, so the Jewish people. And it uses all this Jewish language and shows, do you see how Jesus everything in our religion that wasn't quite tied up neatly, he does it and brings it together. Right before this passage, the author talks about Sabbath rest, which is, from creation, this symbol of a time where rather than working, we focus on our relationship with God. Rather than being active, we can kind of tune down and just be. And the author, as most theologians do, sees that is kind of a typology, that's a foreshadowing of salvation, of heaven, of what it's really supposed to be about where we are really supposed to be. But then he also goes on from there and talks about the type of obedience that we need to enter into that. And he talks about Joshua and when the Jews were coming into the promised land and how they had to be obedient to God in order to conquer all these people and stuff. And he goes on from there, and the last thing he talks about before this, it's a very hopeful reading, right? It's a feel-good reading. He talks about this feel-good Sabbath rest stuff. He talks about the need for stringent obedience. And then he talks about God/Jesus like this. The word of God is living and effective, sharper than any two-edged sword, penetrating even between soul and spirit, joints and marrow, and able to discern reflections and thoughts of the heart. So you see the author, he kind of builds up so much is at stake, and we have to be obedient, and God knows every inch of us where we're obedient and not obedient, which is really scary, because when you think about even yourself, we don't measure up. And then it goes on to say, but we have a high priest who can sympathize with us. So Jesus knows us, but he also has compassion and empathy for us. It's one thing to have empathy for a person that you don't know all that well, but for me, the person who I have the most trouble being empathetic with is my wife, because I know her so well, and I want to say, have you not learned yet? Have you not figured this out? Oh my gosh, and again you're upset about this, again and she does the same thing to me. She has to work so hard to be empathetic with me because she knows me enough to know to sometimes predict me, to sometimes think I should know better, but Jesus knows us through and through and sympathizes with us, even when he knows how screwed up we are, and knows the core of how screwed up we are, I guess, not just the behavior. Jesus in the letter to the Hebrews he's portrayed as a priest, and he's portrayed as an exemplar of faith and trust. This passage is talking about him more as a priest, and what the letter goes on to say, and it's in the readings for the next few weeks, is it talks about when the Old Testament priests would offer sacrifice, they went into the temple, this place where God dwelt quite literally. And by going in there and bringing a sacrifice, they were able to like kind of humbly nourish this relationship and make that deep, deep connection. And Hebrews is talking about, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, and Hebrews looks at heaven and says, if the temple is where God was for us when we were Jews, imagine Jesus didn't go to the temple. Jesus went to heaven, where God is as much as God can be anywhere, so much more than the temple. He took our level of connection to God from the temple to God himself. And then there's this little line at the end, which we don't think about as much, but we can confidently approach the throne of grace. for mercy and grace for timely help. And it kind of juxtaposes how high up Jesus is and how much he sympathizes with us. You know, he's someone who we can approach, but also by approaching him, we approach the highest of highs, you know, the greatest help. It's kind of trippy to put all that together, you know.
It is, really.
So yeah, that something so grand is so easy to approach. Yeah. We ready to move on to the gospel? All right. Elaine, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. The gospel is Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. And Elaine, you'll see on that missal, there's a long version and a short version. We'll go ahead and do the long version. We have time.
Okay. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." He replied, "What do you wish me to do for you?" They answered him, "Grant that in your glory we may sit, one at your right and the other at your left." Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Can you drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" They said to him, "We can." Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right or at my left is not mine to give, but is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they became indignant at James and John. Jesus summoned them and said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers over the Gentiles, Lord is over them, and their great ones make their authority over them felt. But it shall not be so among you. Rather, whoever wishes to be great among you will be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you will be the slave of all. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as ransom for many." That was the end. Was that the end?
The gospel of the Lord.
The gospel of the Lord.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Any initial thoughts? It can be tough because we've heard this, you know, probably 40, 50 times before in our lives, just in church, let alone outside. What jumps out to us?
For me, it's the connection with the other readings and the strength of being a servant. And that God is asking us to be His servant.
I like the word you used, the strength of being a servant. I think that usually it takes more strength to serve than it does to try and dominate. A different type of strength, but more of it. Yeah. It's one of those messages I think that we have to constantly be reminded of, especially in in most world cultures where the people who get to feel best about themselves, or the people who get to feel the best in total, are the people who are, highest up on the ladder. But it doesn't bode well for your relationship with God a lot. Let's look at a couple of the fine points, and we can draw this out even more. When we're looking at context, the Gospel of Mark it's one of the most in-your-face Gospels, and it's also one of the most blatant about how freaking stupid the apostles were. One of the theories is that Mark, who wrote it, he wasn't one of the apostles. He was apparently, they think, when they look at the language and the diction and how it's aimed, they think he was writing in Rome to Romans, and trying to tell them the story of Jesus. And if he's writing in Rome, that means he's up there with Peter. And we all know that out of all the apostles who screwed up, other than maybe Judas, Peter screwed up the most, and the most embarrassingly. And somehow he gets made the Pope, which the popes actually say, when they reflect on what it means to be Pope, they say, oh yeah, we have to know the most how much we screw up to be Pope. Because only someone who knows how bad they can, only someone who has been broken down to a sense of humility can try and speak for God and not do something stupid. Peter got all his stupid stuff out of the way early. But this is like the 5th time that Jesus has tried to get this point across in the gospel. In the Gospel of Mark, the apostles, they can't quite figure out Jesus is God, and they can't quite get it through their heads that being the strong man, being on top, is not what this is all about. They do it at the blessing of the children, which we read just a couple weeks ago at Mass. Jesus takes the little child and says, you must be like little children. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. And then he goes on and he says, would you rather lose your life and gain it back, or gain the world and lose your soul? And then he says, the first will be last and the last will be first. And they say, oh, okay, sure. And he predicts his passion, that he's going to die. And in the Gospel of Mark, he doesn't focus a whole lot on the fact he's going to rise again. He focuses more on the fact, guys, they're going to kill me. And they're like, whoa, that's deep, Jesus. And then it doesn't quite absorb. And and then after all that, James and John come up and they say, so Jesus, when you're on your throne in glory, and we think when they ask that, they're not asking about when Jesus is in heaven. They're not thinking that far ahead. They think Jesus is going to go to Jerusalem, throw out the Romans, and establish a new Israel kingdom. And they want to be officers in the kingdom. After all that, that's the way they think still. And it's interesting because some people read the Gospel of Mark in different ways. Some people say Mark is saying you have to do better than this to all the people he's talking to. He has to say, you have to make the choice. Please stop beating around the bush. Jesus made it clear so many times and they didn't get it. It is hard, but just make the decision, be this way. And some people read it and say, oh, isn't it nice to know that they were real people and they screwed up too? And some people read it and they say, wow, you know what, it really is hard, and we do have to really keep trying at this, because all of our instincts are pushing us away from the way Jesus is trying to tell us to be. And it certainly was for them. They came up and they say, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Which is actually a really good thing to say to God. It shows a lot of confidence. I think Teresa of Avila says, when you ask God for great things, he takes it as a compliment because that means you have a lot of faith in God. And I love how Jesus answers, because he does this all in the gospel. He doesn't say, yeah, I know you want this and this and this, even though he does. The book of Hebrews already told us he sees through the soul. He gives us a chance to say it, and he says, what do you want me to do for you? And then they say, we want this. We want to sit on your right and your left in your kingdom. And Jesus, it's really interesting because they think they know exactly what they want, and Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking for. Can you drink the cup I must drink, be baptized with the baptism I must be baptized by? And they say, we can, and he says, yes, well, you will be. And I think he's saying, you have no idea what that means, but you're still going to get it. What they're asking for, I think sometimes we can ask for stuff from Jesus and not know what we're asking for too. We ask for salvation, but we don't ask to go through the process we need to go through to become holy. We ask for something that looks good to us, but we don't understand all the implications of that. So even there, I think that it's an interesting lesson to think about. But he goes on further, and he's talking about the baptism I must be baptized by, the cup I must drink, and I did not come to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom. He talks about a couple foreshadowing aspects of what Jesus' salvation is, the salvation he's giving us. The baptism idea. Does anyone know what baptism in Greek meant? It did not mean pour water over your baby's head. And my wife and I are kind of arguing about this because when our baby gets baptized, she wants just to pour water over the head and make it nice and neat and not get the baby's clothes, dirty. But the word baptism meant immersion, to be plunged under. And part of the salvation Jesus offers us is he is plunged down to the bottom of what it means to be human and into the bottom of what it means to be separate from God. He's killed as a political scapegoat, and all his friends abandon him. And he, like in his passion, some will argue, he faces all the dysfunction that humanity can throw at a person. And he goes, we say in the Nicene Creed, he goes all the way down to hell, to the very, very bottom of what it is to be apart from God, to connect with all the people even there who are capable of connecting with him there. And then he goes up to heaven. And that's baptism, because being baptized plunged under water in the ancient world was a symbol of chaos, of God-forsakenness, which sounds really weird, but in all the ancient myths, other than the Bible, the Creator God has to fight a sea monster. And if you look at like Revelation, all the monsters in Revelation come out of the ocean, because the ocean is the place of chaos. Because when you're living in the first century and you don't have scuba gear, the ocean is terrifying. And every once in a while when someone sees a whale and they come back and try and tell you what you see, you're terrified. So being plunged underwater is not a cute thing. It's a very scary thing. And Jesus is baptized in everything about our human condition. He is plunged into it. The other thing, the cup and the ransom, is this other aspect of salvation that the Bible talks about. And it's that Jesus makes atonement. He makes up for what we owe God. As I think St. Anselm in the 10th century put it, like, by our sins, we owe a debt to God we can't fulfill. But Jesus can honor God to the point where he can give God something valuable enough to offset that debt. I don't think that idea in itself, without the whole immersion aspect, is a great explanation for what it means to be saved in Jesus, but it's an important part of it. And it's a part the Jews could get because the Jews had those guilt offerings we talked about, where you made an offering that offset the debt you owed God because you forgot to make your other offering, or you accidentally cheated on your taxes or something like that. So sorry, that's me just geeking out. But he calls for service and humility as the basis for prowess rather than ambition, rather than authority. And first of all, he does it with James and John. They're we'd like to think of them as he's using them as a bad example. He says, guys, don't do this. But when we look at it, he doesn't say that until the other 10 get mad. They come up and they say something stupid. And he says, yes, you'll get the rough part. I can't tell you if you'll get the fun part, but you will go through the rough part with me. And then the other ones get mad. And when I read that, for me, I'm a type A personality. And I've James and John they're being really type A, right? I try, and I don't always do it, but I try and tell myself, you don't deserve to be in control. You don't need to be in control. Don't grab for the reins. Chill out, relax, be part of the team. And I can do that until someone else grabs for the reins, and then I just burl up and I'm like, don't you dare, if anybody's grabbing for the reins, it's me, and I'm not doing it because I'm being such a nice guy. And that's what the other apostles do. They stand up and they say, how dare you want to be better than us? Which is, I think, really them saying, how dare you want to be better than us? Because that might mean you actually are better than us and we want to be better than you. And that's when Jesus has to say, no, guys, it's not about being the best. It's about being the most loving. It's about being the most dedicated. It's about letting go of your ambition and just being a loving person in God's plan and trusting that God is going to work it all out well and give you what you need. And holy cow, that's hard. You all probably know better than me, but the thing it makes me think of is I spend a whole lot of time on Catholic YouTube and stuff, trying to learn the things we need to do to share our faith and learn the right words to say when I'm talking to a teenager and they have an issue or something. And what I find is a lot of talking heads, a lot of religious orders. There's so many people in our church today, especially today, that are grasping for the steering wheel, that are trying to gain some influence, who are trying to push the church in a certain direction or another direction. And it stresses me out because I think I know the best direction, of course. And everyone wants to be a reformer and everyone wants to save the church because we're having a rough time. And I look at that and I always go back to St. Francis because it seems like a good portion of the people who want to be the influencers, who want to be the superheroes, who have all this ambition, even if it's good ambition for the church, they get themselves in trouble at some point, or it becomes more about control, then it becomes about Jesus. And that's why St. Francis is an inspiration to me, because he was the number one him and St. Dominic together. But he was like the greatest reformer that we remember in Christianity. And he did it all by not trying to be in control, by making himself less, by saying, I'm going to go serve the lepers. And by being that authentic, he brought all these people around who started living a more authentic Christian life. Anyway, sorry. But for me, that's a personal lesson I have to remember. When everyone's grabbing for the reins, this is something I can't hope to control. I've just got to do my small part and be a servant. And if I'm lesser, one, I won't worry about being in control, and two, God will actually use me for what he needs. So, shoot, I'm sorry. We're going late. Can we just do one more slide to talk about the some of the tie-ins? The reading from Hebrews talked about approaching the throne of grace. James and John came up and say, Jesus, we want whatever you can give us. When you're on your throne, they're thinking ahead and trying to approach the throne. But they're doing it thinking they know what's going on, and really Jesus knows more than them. And isn't that the same thing from Hebrews? It's talking about Jesus knows us more deeply and sympathizes with us. The salvation thing we kind of talked about, but there's these aspects of the suffering, the baptism, the drinking this cup, the becoming a ransom, dealing with the guilt aspect of our alienation from God, what we owe God, and also the more sin aspect, that lack of holiness. And doing both of those by taking everything we are and we have and moving with us and going to the very pinnacle of what God is, from the very bottom of what we are. And the last thing I would say is just that sense of trust, the trust that servant has to have, the trust that we ask to have in the psalm, the trust that we can have in Jesus because we know he sympathizes with us and we know we can approach that throne of grace because of that. And the trust it takes to be a servant. Because when you're a servant, when you're putting yourself lower, it means it's much easier for someone to kick you while you're down. It means you don't get to put your plans in place. You have to let God's plans work around through other people's plans around you that you can't control. Yeah, I don't know. Any thoughts, questions, or sarcastic remarks? I feel terrible like blabbing for an hour straight, but yeah.
I mean, one of my favorite verses of all time, well, not stretch of verses, but in Philippians where he talks about, he says that Jesus, rather than grasping for his equality with God, emptied himself and became obedient, taking the form of a slave, even to the point of the cross. And it talks about this all, and because of that, because he was willing to put his trust in God, because in the garden he says, if there's some other way to do this, I'm open to suggestions, like,
Yeah.
do we have to do it this way? But ultimately, because he says, your will be done, and he has that obedience, and he empties himself, then he's exalted above all, because but it's because he was willing to do those things. He was willing to be obedient. He was willing to trust. He was willing to do what God asked of him, even to die on the cross.
Yeah.
And that's how he gets exalted. That's how he becomes the name that is above every other name. And it just,
Yeah.
I guess because I like that verse so much, but it sounds like that's exactly
It-
what we're called to do as
Mhm.
we're able.
That's exactly right. And Glenda, you know that I love Philippians 2, right? That's that's it part and parcel. And the thing I always wonder about is, sorry, you're just getting my associative mind going, but you know, he was glorified because he did this. I almost feel like the glory is found in doing that, not rewarded from the outside. Like
Right.
Jesus says, who wants to be first should be last. The last shall be first and the first shall be last. Sometimes I wonder, is that God's gonna, when we line up to heaven, he's gonna pick out the most lowly people first and give them all these glamorous, Price is Right prizes in heaven? Or when we get there, are we gonna realize that all the real glory and all the real holiness and closeness and presence to God and the way God was shining through was in them the whole time? Maybe both. I don't know. But yeah. Anyways, yeah. Well, thank you all so much for coming out. I hope this was okay. I know I'm not Brother Bob and not even close to as funny as he is, but the scriptures are cool.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And now we all have plenty of ammo. When our priest starts preaching, we can open up our notebooks and say, are you going to hit on this? Where are you going?
Where are you gonna take this?
Yes. So, all right.
Well, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Makes me
I'm
want to say.
I'm going to turn the camera off here, and yeah, then we can continue to do whatever, So.